Hello and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larson.
Nick, thank you very much for joining me today on the Grow Places podcast. It's a real privilege to have you on. You know, I've been an admirer of your work, the work of Argent, and obviously now everything you're doing with Urban Partners. I was fascinated, you know, we're sat here, aren't we, just off Oxford Street in the Urban Partners UK headquarters, which I didn't really even know was a part of the,
still small,
of the
but
company.
Growing. Small but
so
growing.
It'd be great to hear about that and you personally. And so I don't know how you introduce yourself these days, but how do you do that?
So my name's Nick Searl. I'm 61 and a half.
The half is important.
The half's important. It always has been. How do I introduce myself? My roots are professionally in architecture, and I still kind of feel a real connection to that aspect of what I do. So I'm definitely an architect who, for all sorts of reasons, became a developer. I think it suits my personality more than just sitting quietly in a room designing, to be out there and managing processes and getting things done. So a property developer for 25, 30 years in Thailand, firstly for 5 years, and then in London for 25. And now an advisor to Urban Partners based in Copenhagen, who are an investment business, primarily an investment business. And working with them, looking at how we can align capital with the needs of large-scale urban regeneration. Always a challenge. So yeah, that's kind of me in a professional nutshell, shall we say?
Okay. And then, do you have any other nutshells?
My other big nutshells are a lot of people in the street, you know, come and say, "Oh, you're a cyclist, Nick, aren't you?" And they knew me because I was cycling. Actually, I've been a runner since I was like 5 years old. I was the running boy in my local village, and I had a nasty back operation in 2008, and for a decade I didn't run. So I took up cycling, and so that's why everybody saw me as a cyclist. And I worked with Club Peloton. I really, really enjoyed it. But my first love is running. And I'm back doing it again now and doing quite a lot of it. I've got a little bit more time than I used to have. So that is one of my other nutshells. That is that. Obviously, I have a family. I've grown up children now who are 27 and 30. So the sort of day-to-day of small children is in the rearview mirror, though you never know. There might be a next generation coming at some point. And increasingly, I think, you know, there is an interesting aspect to life as you evolve from being that full-time worker. And when I say, for me, full-time meant that. It didn't mean stopping at weekends and things. My brain never stopped, like so many of us. And so actually having more space in your brain allows you to start exploring other things. And it doesn't mean you suddenly leap into becoming something else, but you do find you just have the time and the space to just do things that you wouldn't have otherwise done, and to spend more time with people in a way that you wouldn't have previously done. And that in itself is, it's a real, there's a sense of freedom that comes with that, for sure. But also, you stop cutting things off before you found out whether it works for you. You've just got that time to just kind of seep into things a bit more, and seep into, you know, other people and longer conversations, and that's, I find that, you know, a real joy doing that. Not having to constantly look at the watch and say I've got to be somewhere in 10 minutes. There's still a bit of that.
Yeah.
But you know, I haven't stopped it completely, but there's a real interesting balance for me now with these things, and I find I do have some periods in certainly each month, I wouldn't say every week, where there is a real kind of like, okay, I haven't actually got anything diarised to do right now. And that allows you to just do something you may not have otherwise done.
Yeah, fascinating. And you know, you've had an incredible career, and you're at a point now where, as you say, you've got that ability to decide where you spend your time, what fills your diary, and how do you decide that? You know, are you sort of thinking, okay, I want to do things I really enjoy, or things that are really impactful, or things I'm really good at? Or is it a mixture of all of that? Or, you know, how are you sort of deciding how you use your valuable time, really?
I mean, there is a temptation, you know, amongst it for anybody who's been in, you know, a long-term career where it's all very structured and all the rest of it, is you kind of make a plan. And, you know, you write it all down and you say, this is what I want to do, and this is my purpose in life, and this is, and you kind of go, there it is. You know, this is the new version of me, and it's written in a spreadsheet, therefore it must work. You know, and it's not like that at all. It's messy. It's messy as hell. The only way I can describe it is, you know, for a lot of teenagers who are trying to figure out, you know, who are they? What do they want to do? Where do they want to go? What's my identity? You know, all that messy stuff of trying to figure out who you are when you're in your teenage years and you're emerging into further education. It's like it's starting to fall into place a little bit. When you stop full time, it's a bit like doing that all over again, except you have to let a load of stuff go in order to be able to go through that discovery and kind of figure out, okay, well, what do I look like now? It was like, because, you know, I hear quite a lot of people who've, in inverted commas, retired, and when they're asked the question, what do you do? They say, I used to, and they still define themselves by what they've just spent 35 years doing. And I you know, that has all sorts of connotations. You've never letting go of anything. You're never giving yourself the mental space to kind of create something new, a new version of yourself. So it's not a straightforward thing. It is genuinely, sometimes it's quite confusing. And sometimes you don't really know. You sit there like, well, what am I supposed to do now?
Yeah.
You sit with that. What am I supposed to do now? And there isn't just a nice, simple answer. And I think, you see people who actually take the time, I think, do actually end up creating a version of themselves that's equally as genuine as the past one, but they've allowed themselves to find it, so it's real. It's not just a kind of like, because I think the planning process is driven more by what should I do than actually what do I actually want to do and enjoy doing. And it's largely because when you write that plan, your frame of reference, if you don't take a pause in there, your frame of reference is what you've been for the last 30 years. So you basically write another version of that, maybe with some gaps in it, and I'll go and see my mother and, you know, take the dog for a walk, you know, splintered in here and there. And it kind of feels like a softer version. But it's essentially, you're changing like for like in a way. And I think it's only by kind of like really stopping that you kind of emerge with something that's new, because you don't know what you don't know, do you? So some people have a really clear version of it. I know people who've just like, I'm retired, I play golf, I love it. You know, I don't want to do anything else. I don't want anybody to suggest the work word to me ever again. And it's kind of, that's fine. My head's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. And this may be too much of a leap, Nick, but I'm keen to see your thoughts on it. But do you think that way that you've just described, the process of planning, you know, life, if you were to translate that into the way that we plan regeneration, do you think there's a link there? Because the way you were talking about it, you know, we often think, don't we, about how we do things. We kind of tie ourselves to what's been done before. We have these preconceived ideas about where we are. We're not very comfortable with uncertainty or discovery.
I mean, I kind of have a little speech that I do when I'm talking to some of the investors when we're talking about large-scale urban regeneration. And the normal lens to look at it from a an investment perspective is which of the sort of traditional buckets does it sit in? Well, none. And we can't quite define the end. So that translates to risk, which means higher returns, which immediately kills any idea that you might ever invest in it, because it doesn't work like that. And I try to reframe it for them. I don't know how successfully, but I try to reframe it in the context that when you're setting out on something that is 10, 15, maybe even 20 years in the making, the only certainties that you have are that the social, economic, political, technological, environmental conditions in which you are going to deliver this thing will change significantly over the course of your design and delivery operational period. And if we think it, my reference point on that is King's Cross. Of course, a lot changed over the life from 2000 to 2025. A lot changed. Well, the speed of change is only going to be greater now in the future. So what does that say to you? Firstly, it says to you that flexibility and your ability to pivot, to adapt whatever you're doing to the emerging, changing, evolving context in which you're delivering it is the number one priority. And that means working with cities. And that means that means cities, investors and others getting themselves comfortable with the fact that they will start something without knowing what the end looks like precisely. And I would argue that's a good thing. I would argue only fix what you have to fix at any given moment. And I would say within that uncertainty lies the opportunity. Because in there is, firstly, you have time to discover. You have time to start sharing what you're doing with other actors and people who actually do stuff. I mean, we build things, but the operators, you need to go out and meet them and you need to show them what you're doing. And suddenly one of them's going to go, oh my God, we could do this. And you go, I'd never thought of that. And suddenly, there's a whole another world that starts to emerge as you start to talk to them. So that voyage of discovery. If you rigidly try to fix it, you will bake in my view, you will bake in failure. You're baking in failure because in 10 years' time, you will be trying to shoehorn something into a context which no longer works for it. It's as simple as that. And that mindset has to apply even beyond the delivery period, because you've got to design it and manage it in such a way that it can adapt itself once you've finished the building. And I've just been through King's Cross this morning, and the building work hasn't quite worked. There's a few adaptations going on roads, and things are being adapted and changed, and which is kind of slightly annoying when you're trying to get there, but it's all part of the process. And it's adapting to the newness of what they're doing. But they're now pretty much fully in operation mode. And that's a different kind of mindset from the delivery mode, but it equally has to be adaptive. There's a great thing, I think you've seen it, Tom, the Copenhagen Way report that was written about Copenhagen's evolution over the last 35 years. And when they're doing the study there, one of the things they say about how that change has been achieved is through adaptive learning. It's by trying something, learning from it, throwing out the things that don't work, taking the good bits, doing more of that, and being able to respond to the things that are happening that you just didn't know were going to happen. That's a fairly long-winded way of saying, yes, those things are slightly, obviously different. There is that kind of joy of not quite knowing. I listened to, this is a Radio 4 programme I listened to about 5 years ago now. And it was an hour-long programme, and it's called The Lost Art of Getting Lost. And it was brilliant. It was brilliant. So the obvious thing was to people who are pre-phones, smartphones. It's like, you couldn't contact people and you couldn't check your GPS to find out where you actually physically got lost. But I think it was about much, much more than that. It was about, the fact that we do kind of all want this level of certainty in our lives, which is just really hard to achieve, and about us just being a little bit more comfortable with the fact that life actually is lived almost entirely in the grey.
Yeah.
You're not in a black or a white area of life. It's not. There aren't these certainties. It's all grey, and it's all not grey in a negative way. We should use a different term for. We're in the yellow. It sounds so much more positive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're in the yellow. We live life in the yellow, not the red or the green. And it's the programme is as much about the fact that we've lost that ability just to kind of exist without knowing.
Yeah, and there's a very human, isn't it? That there's increased senses of loneliness now, increased anxiety, shorter attention spans, and that element of sort of psychological security that comes as an individual and as a collective, I think is quite important to that sense that you can try things, isn't it? Like you've got the economic safety to be able to go and try explore something which, or you can live in a society that's got trust built into it. That means you can leave your young baby out having a nap in the streets, like which the reason for maybe that sounds slightly obscure, but I was watching the Simon Reeves has just done a Copenhagen series.
I saw it, in Denmark and
it was a big thing about trust, wasn't it? It was about leaving your kids out, and you could say that a lot of these things are kind of connected. And I guess when we think about regeneration, quality of life, Copenhagen way, the King's Cross way, these things they're not really about just the physical, are they? They're about people and kind of emotions and how we interact with each other. And how have you found that aspect of your work, like over time and the impact?
I mean, I've always found it quite fascinating that this is before I was even involved in King's Cross, and the guys did a whole load of, what we would term now old-fashioned consultation. It was like going to, local fetes and all that kind of stuff. And they also, they kids in schools and people writing in, and they had a website and people filled in things, but it was all in early days. And all of this stuff, talking to like 1,000 people, basically what people said were two things. One was, please make it safe and secure. That was the most basic thing. Far more than, how tall is it or how much of it is there or, all of that stuff. Can you just make it safe and secure? This was the most basic human need of feeling safe on the streets outside my house. And the other one was, can you get on with it? Because people have been asking these questions for 25 years. It's like people just get ground down by, it's like, and that's about civic leadership and kind of like, can't you just, you're supposed to be in charge of this. Can't you just get on with it? Rather than continuously asking me and my children what I want. There's a place for that, and there's a place for strong leadership to get on with things. But it always struck me that the top line was just simply safe and secure. Yeah. That's what people were most interested in. And that is the most, we want to be housed, and we want to feel safe in our communities and with our families. And, that's not always how people, well, certainly not how people feel right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's
in many situations. And that's what starts to then create some of the political and social divisiveness that we're starting to see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because as I say, that provides like the bedrock, doesn't it? That allows
people
all
are
other
unstable.
Things to,
people feel very destabilised by that.
Yeah.
And when people feel destabilised and they feel uncertain, people with quick answers who sound good in the moment can be very attractive.
Yeah.
Can sound very attractive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like, back to your personal story, you were saying that you actually took a lot of energy and really enjoyed this period of your life coming out of a long-standing, role. but for a lot of people, that is scary. You know, that change, that uncertainty is a lot to deal with.
And I didn't do what I set out to do at all. This is not, you know, and I haven't followed my own preachings on what you should do here, because I set out to have a year completely just take it out. And you know, within 3 months I was in Copenhagen, you know, having chats and presenting to their board. And within the 3 months after that, I was signed up and working. Now, it's a part-time role, so I only work 2-3 days a week. So that was part of it. I'm not on the payroll, as in I'm not an employee, I'm an external. I feel very much a part of it, but actually, you know, how I feel about what I do, actually, it's quite important to me that, and I think I can do a better job as an advisor by sitting outside the business than being inside it. But no, I intended to take that time, and I didn't take all that time. I didn't go full back in with both feet, but I've gone back in enough that I am very involved. I do enjoy it. If I wasn't enjoying it, I wouldn't be doing it. And I've got enough space. There are times when I kind of think maybe it's getting a bit too much, and so I'm still figuring it out. I am still very much figuring it out, but I'm working with brilliant people in a brilliant business, getting to go to some amazing places and see some extraordinary projects. So it's kind of like what's not to like, you know, is kind of where I'm at with it now, and I'll keep going with it all the while I'm enjoying it, and you know those things continue to be true.
Yeah, totally. And we've had your colleague Jesse Shapins on the podcast before, so listeners could go and digest that one, because we did a really interesting deep dive, not just about Jesse, but about partners and what they do, and you know, business I look up to incredibly strong track record, both when they were NREP and now. But if you take, for you personally, if you take the two sides of the coin, so why did they want you, and why did you agree to go there? Have you got a sense of that? I
mean, you know, I think most of people that I worked with over the last 10 years, and you know, my lovely partners, who I still adore all of them at Argent, you know, would Nick end up working in an investment business? They'd probably say that's pretty unlikely, not his natural landing place. But these are people who are, you know, the 20-year-old business. They've expanded it quite dramatically. I think Jesse said, you know, in the podcast with you, that Mikkel, the founder, has a basic saying, which is, you know, doing good is good business. And that sounds great, doesn't it? It's right. But actually, when I got over there and I listened to all these people, I didn't feel like I was in, you know, what the internal image I had of being inside an investment business like this, an investment management business like this. It was very, very different. I felt immediately at home and comfortable in the city and in their offices. The kind of conversations I was having were the kind of conversations that I want to have about how do you make structural change? How does what we do make a difference on the ground to people's lives? And that's just the conversations I heard everywhere I went. It was all, of course, you know, covered with the veil of, you know, and we have to make money for our investors. But actually, by trying to align those two things, rather than saying, you know, it's a binary choice between them, actually that's a really fascinating challenge. And for me, I found for me that fact that it wouldn't be my natural landing place, that was the intellectual challenge for me. Was, okay, how, you know, I've looked at this as a designer, I've gone through various phases of, you know, project management, development management. I was involved in office leasing, retail, estate management, and then ended up, you know, leading the business for a while. So looked at it from all of these perspectives. I spent time with the banks, I spent time with investors, but mostly telling them the story of what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're going to do it and why it makes sense. So suddenly to be sitting now and looking at this through the lens of a financial institution or a manager of the money, the capital that's coming out of financial institutions, was challenging, fascinating. You almost have to learn a new language, because they speak in a bundle of acronyms that, I'm starting to pick it up. But, to be honest with you, the transition from architect, project manager to propco type thing, there's a whole load of language there, which when I walked in the door, I was like, I don't even know what you guys are talking about. And you have to kind of learn the language, and then you realise that a lot of it is just, doesn't mean anything. And you put it to one side, and it's the same thing here. There's just all the language and all the ways of doing things that you just have to kind of peer through, and then you're like, okay, it's not actually that complicated, this. It's really not. So that was my rationale. This was an interesting group of people trying to do interesting things. It was an intellectual challenge. It's in a place that I love, and I'm looking way beyond. I spent 25 years looking at 3 projects. I've looked at probably 20 in the last year or so. So expanding, how I might apply the things that I've now experienced. For them, I think, for them, having somebody in the team who's kind of grown up inside the process of actually doing this is quite important. And it comes back to why I say I think my benefit to them is actually greater when I'm sitting outside as an advisor than being an in-house developer or something. One is I don't want to be on the cutting edge of doing the development again. I've kind of done that for a long time. But I can raise some pretty tough issues, and I can, I've no axe to grind on all of this. So I can be very straight on what my opinions are with the people who need to hear it. And, that feels good. And so far, so good. They seem to appreciate that. Just having experience within the business. They're not suddenly going to become developers in the same way as, an Argent or one of our big devcos is. But they do need to understand this as a product, if you like, for want of another word. It's different from building a single building or even 2 or 3 buildings. It's a very, very different mindset that you apply.
Mm. Yeah, no, fascinating. And it's very location specific as well, isn't it? Whereas, obviously their home is Copenhagen, Denmark, the Nordics, but you are looking Europe-wide, aren't you?
As I say, they've built this business. It's been essentially in the Nordics. And the only way the business really grows is to start looking beyond that. There's already activity in Germany in particular. There's already activity in Finland, some of those other sort of Baltic areas. And the UK is now also, we're sitting in the Urban Partners UK office. It's a relatively small office at the moment, but I'm sure that's going to be expanding over the coming years. The UK market's challenging, we all know that. It's not difficult, so only the right projects are going to be taken on, the right investments are going to be invested in. But no, the UK is an important part of the future, I'm sure. Certainly that's part of what I'm looking at. Is what are the opportunities here?
Yeah, and that revolves around scale essentially. Is it? You got to have neighbourhood scale impact.
The business will look at very different aspects. I'm particularly looking at that larger scale regeneration aspect of their business. But I think that, their business is much broader. They're a 20 billion euro, 25 billion, I think, euro business. They employ over 700 people. It's a substantive business, and they have many strands to it. So I think those strands will, some of those strands will arrive here in the UK. Some may not. If the urban regeneration piece can, I think that would be fantastic. But as I say, it's pretty tough right now. Yeah, it's pretty tough.
Yeah. So how do you see that UK aspect then? Whether you're answering this as your role at Urban Partners or just you from your experience, you know, you mentioned it's tough. Everyone knows it's tough, but how do we kind of move beyond it? You know, we could sit here and talk about viability. We could talk about housing. We could talk about a number of different things related to some of the more human political aspects that we've kind of loosely touched on naturally through this conversation. But sort of stepping back from it all and the kind of, you know, how do you think we think about these generational type projects in the UK?
I mean, I think there's a kind of fundamental truth. I mean, King's Cross was purely private. When you look at King's Cross now and you look at how it came about, it's hard to see how you would do it today. I think it would be a lot more difficult. This country has a pretty poor history, or shall we say, a checkered history of public-private partnerships, PFIs and all that kind of stuff. But that collaboration there in some form is the only way we really solve this. I don't think I have a unique view that for the last 40 years various governments of all colours have slightly outsourced or significantly outsourced the delivery of housing to the private sector. When we started doing King's Cross, there were grants and all sorts of things in the early noughties that helped to get those things off the ground, and that all just kind of disappeared. But we have to redesign that relationship, because it doesn't work to just outsource housing to the private sector. That's, commercial businesses aren't set up with the same objectives as governments, who's have a responsibility to sort of house the nation, as it were. And by just sort of central government passing down responsibilities onto boroughs, you end up with hotels and all the costs that's going into temporary housing, and you just see the whole system doesn't work. So redesigning a system that works is going to be essential to how we facilitate not just the housing, but just large-scale regeneration per se. You can get so far with just English public sector support through grants and things, so you can that will get you so far. But we're seeing numerous situations now where grants and loans have been made to support infrastructure, but the cost of those is now actually becoming a drag on the development. So those loans weren't made; they were there to facilitate the delivery of housing. Now they're now dragging that housing delivery. So again, there's a system there that kind of was designed with good intent, but it's not really working. So, we've tried this here before. There's been various efforts to look, and the whole housing as infrastructure kind of debate is an important and interesting one. And I go back to the work that was done by Urban Partners and others, Arup and C40 Cities, looking at the Copenhagen Way and looking at the future of Europe. And they do a really interesting analysis where they look at the offshore wind industry in Denmark, where I was talking to one of our one of the partners at Urban Partners, and she used to work in a different pension fund, and she was saying 10, 12 years ago investing in offshore wind wasn't really a thing, and then they worked out how it could be structured such that the pension fund would build it. There'd be a kind of underwritten, guaranteed payment stream for indexed over 30, 40 years. So the you de-risked the initial investment, and then after 40 years, the wind farms went back to the state. By which time, the investor had got their money back, made a decent return, and everybody walked away happy. And you've still got this going on. And a lot of Danish renewable energy is financed on that kind of basis. And the argument in the Copenhagen Way report is, why can't you just replace windmills with housing? And just governments know that they've got a housing need. The demand is not a problem, and they're going to have to pay. And if in the UK, if you're not paying for somebody to be in a house that's been purpose designed, then you're paying for them to be in a hotel, which is probably going to be more expensive and less appropriate, and just causing all the social problems that we know. So that sounds, it's not as simple as that. Obviously, it's not as simple as that. But fundamentally, we have to design systems. We have to co-create solutions to these problems. And we have to start from positions of trust in this. This comes back to so much of what I've seen in our industry over so many years, is everybody starts the conversation from a position of distrust, and by pointing out the failures of the other party and pointing out the areas where we have fundamental disagreement, instead of focusing on all the areas where we actually have, alignment, and, focusing on those areas, articulating those areas, defining how we deliver on those areas. And then from that position, because through the process of that definition, you actually build the trust and the relationship that is required to solve the difficult bit. And, I'm not telling anybody anything particularly new there. That I think, in many other industries, that is a basic tenet of how you get stuff done. But in our industry, it seems to me that there's this kind of ideological polarization between councils and developers, even sometimes between designers and developers and investors and cities, and there's there's a sense that it's kind of all or nothing. It's like there's very little recognition that everybody kind of has to take something out of this, and it can't be all you, it can't be all the other. I hear so much language. It's the language of war. People talk about going into battle with the council. It's like we win planning permissions. By definition, somebody's lost a planning permission, therefore. It's like that the whole mentality is this battle process to see who wins and loses. And it has always kind of driven me crazy that we have to have, this dynamic is set up. It's not even at the beginning of a project. It's set up as a fundamental, positioning of two armies before they even start to have a discussion with each other, before they've even fallen out over something. They're already entrenched in they're the enemy. Until we can overcome that position and see ourselves, I like the notion that we become co-creators and that we can't do it without the other one, and we all have to gain something out of it. But equally, the days of a developer making super profits are probably gone. But I would argue that if you've actually got the certainty of continuously decent profits, that's much better, because we hear about when people make super profits. We very rarely hear about the majority of the time when people are actually making nothing or less than nothing, they're going bust. And they're going bust. And it's easy as an industry for us to kind of go, well, the politicians are all rubbish and they're designing systems that don't work, and there's some truth in all of that. And it's easy for the city to sit there and go, well, these are rapacious developers who are trying to, stiff us and get us, all this stuff. And there's the truth in that as well. But it's like, yeah, we can go on yelling at each other and throwing stones at each other as long as we like, but it's not going to get us anywhere. We know that because we've been doing it for however many years. So I think there is a root and branch mindset issue that needs to change. And it's not incumbent on one or the other. I think both groups, and it's multiple groups and stakeholders that need to come together. I think we need to, there are attempts to get people in rooms, but I still think the mindset is wrong.
Yeah,
the mindset is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and also, they're very cyclical. Those things you've mentioned. The developers only ever potentially making the super profit if the market's carried them.
Yeah.
We're in a situation in the UK where we don't necessarily have that sort of predictable growth forecast looking forwards, and also where we've got, as you say, the local authorities and boroughs don't necessarily have the fiscal headroom to be able to, to sort of provide the grant or to step in and to do things themselves. So this sort of adversarial relationship where either you blame each other or you kind of, on one hand you're blaming each other, but at the same time you're also relying on each other to deliver your outcomes. Like there isn't the incentives there, is there? The incentives are just so misaligned.
I do. One of the things that frustrates me quite a lot is because ultimately leadership needs to come from the leadership of the country. And this is probably going to sound quite unfair to some people who are involved in this process, but I think you can stand back from the current government who've walked in and said, we need to deliver 1.5 million homes in 5 years. And then they've probably had some really good conversations about how do we do that and the rest of it. But fundamentally, they haven't taken responsibility for the outcome. Fundamentally, they still expect that will be delivered by the private sector, with a few bits on the edges here and there. And it feels, and this is where people say that's unfair, Nick, you can't, that's not completely true. And it's not, there's always, back to our grey and yellow areas, it's not black and white on this. But it feels like when it doesn't happen, they can point at a load of other people and say it didn't happen because of all these people over here who didn't do this and didn't do that. Rather than actually owning not just the target and all the rest of it, but actually owning that outcome. And when you actually own the outcome and your very political existence is determined by it, which it probably will be, in part, you will take different decisions. And in order to solve this, is the other aspect of this, is in order to achieve that, admirable target, you're going to upset some people. It's not, leadership isn't about pleasing everybody as you do this. There's going to have to be some really tough decisions in there about what you can and can't do. And that's going to involve some pretty top-down processes at times, which there will be placards in the streets at times. Sorry, that's leadership. That's what you have to do. That's how change occurs. Now, not everyone will like it, but if that's what you believe is necessary, if you have a fundamental, value-based position that we require this as a nation in order to grow and prosper, then we have to get some of the barriers out of the way and do it. Do it. And we don't. And political leadership doesn't own that in that way. And until such time as we really get that sense of ownership, and unfortunately, the populists promise that kind of solution, but they'll never deliver it. They will never deliver that. it's not in their interest to solve the problem, because then there wouldn't be anything for them to shout about. So I think, you know, we need good, strong, democratic institutions, and we need good, strong leadership within them that allows us to actually get on with this stuff, because we don't. I mean, look at the debacle over HS2. My God.
Yeah, and another, you know, we talked about trust in a very kind of interpersonal way in this conversation, but if you translate trust into kind of a business sense, it's kind of sentiment and confidence, isn't it? That's kind of where these things kind of translate to. And if you're thinking about long-term regeneration, you know, you have to have that lens, don't you? That is gonna, you know, you have to know that the sand that you're standing on is stable enough that you're going to be able to bring forward some of these initiatives. Now, that's not to say that things don't change, and obviously, you know, administrations do change. If you look at, you know, King's Cross over 20 to 25 years, there's been big shifts over that period. But there have to be, as you say, some kind of sort of directions of travel, some commonalities within that everyone's pulling towards, that allow both public sector and private sector to get behind things and to move things forwards.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's an old story now, but the Principles for a Human City for King's Cross, I think, was flipping genius. And its genius was in that nobody drew anything for 12 months. Because the moment you draw something, it's kind of, people like it or they don't like it. It's polarizing instantly. Because words are so much more nuanced, and you can spend time actually working together on that. And through the process of working on the words and what's meaningful and what's not, that's the trust is built in that process. So a year of writing there, the principles themselves are important, and they were a guide to the next stage. They were like, you know, the most basic of brief. What do we believe in? And then the next layer, you know, of planning documents kind of use them as their reference point, and you know, you could judge, is that good or bad? Well, it complies with 10 of those, so yeah, it's pretty good. But if you turned up with a plan and gone, well, you know, what do you think? Instant binary, I like it, I don't like it, it's too tall, it's too small, it's all that stuff. Instant. So what do you mean you don't like it? I've got the best architect in the world working on it. All of the normal stuff that we go through. So the genius there was the process. I'd say the process was actually more important than the output in a way, because that was where all, you know, and that was English Heritage, the Camden Council, and, you know, private developer sitting down. The private developer kind of ended up being the ultimate author, but with the input, forwards written by the CEOs of the two other organisations, saying, you know, this is a shared manifesto, we believe in this. God, that's powerful. That's so powerful. How many developments do you know do that? Spend a year creating a joined up manifesto between the three. I mean, that you know, people say, why did King's Cross work out well? It's like, because of that stuff. That was the difference. People thought about all of that, spent time on it and all the rest of it. And, you know, you can't always spend that much time. You know, it's tough. And as I say, it was a product of its time, its place, its economic context, its political context, all that kind of stuff. It was a product of its time, but there are real fundamental lessons in there which I think do apply. And even if they're difficult, they're still worth looking at and taking advice from, if you like. They're not, you know, King's Cross is not a blueprint for anywhere. It's not. But there are things that were done, and there were focuses of attention in areas that aren't given the same focus by many other developers in many other places. And I think, and cities, you know, it's a two-way thing. And I think that's where if there is a learning, it's in that kind of thing more than how big were their buildings, you know, what percentage of public space did they have? You know, it's like, yeah, they're all interesting things, but they're kind of usually quite site specific, and you can get some learnings from some of that stuff, but the process for me was the real winner, because it served. It doesn't mean that nobody didn't have a fallout in the 20 years that followed. They did, of course they did, and it went through. You just said it went through all sorts of political spectrums, but the bedrock of a trusting institutional relationship was built. And at various times it started to chip down a bit and it had to be rebuilt. And you can't just depend upon what you did in 2001, 2002 to still be there in 20. You've got to work on it continuously. But at least you've started from a position of strength in that relationship. So that's my reflection, and I'm reflecting on that now, looking at, I'm spending quite a lot of time in Germany and listening to the debates that are going on in Germany, and the money that's now being made available in the city for security spending and infrastructure spending across the whole nation, and how that's playing out in different parts of the country and the different politics of the different cities. I was in Munich at an event just a couple of weeks ago. And while most of it was in German, so I didn't understand it all, I did get a bit of a readout afterwards that some of it was quite tense between developers and the city about some of their aspirations and things. But really interesting to see that debate happening, and looking at some of the big opportunities that they've got there. I don't mean I'm personally looking at them, but I can see them. And you can see good potential relationships being built that will serve those opportunities well, and you can also see people who are just making, the usual sort of stones and glass house type commentary that the other side are all to blame. So it's not just here. It's kind of it's embedded in the way that cities grow, I suppose. It's probably been going on since the days of Rome.
yeah, it has. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Consensus and bringing people together.
Yeah, and how do you build that consensus?
Bedrock of
but the balance between democratic process, consensus, and strong leadership.
Yeah.
And that's always a fine balance.
Yeah.
It's always a fine balance. But I just feel like we're under-indexing on the strong leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And then for you, Nick, I could talk about this stuff with you all day, and but just coming back to you personally, then for a second, I think there's a clear sense of kind of why you do what you do, kind of coming across in everything, and you talk about trust with institutions, and before this, when we were preparing for this, you talked about the trusting relationship that you've had with the British Library as one of the core institutions that we have in this country over the past year or so with your podcast series. So I found that fascinating, so I wouldn't mind you just sharing a bit about that, and if anyone wanted to go and find out more.
Well, it was really interesting. We were approached by the British Library, who have an audio library, and they have part of the audio library is something called Architects' Lives. And some of the architects who've been interviewed over the years a couple of times said, you should maybe have a chat with those guys at King's Cross, because there's a couple of architects in there, and but they're obviously doing something else. So they approached us, ended up with, I think, 4 of us, agreeing to do quite in-depth interviews with the specialist interviewers from the Architects' Lives audio library. And when I say in depth, it was 18 hours over a course of about a year. There was an element of therapy about the whole thing, because it is very in depth. It goes back to, not just first principles, but, the first day of your life, and kind of builds. It's a very personal thing. And, I kind of thought to myself, who's ever going to want to listen to all this? And she said to me, look, in 200 years' time, people are going to look at these bits of the city, and they can still see physically the drawings and the images and everything, but they'll want to understand what was going on, who were the people who were involved, what was challenging them at the time, what was the context for them professionally and personally. And that's now an extraordinary piece of historical reference for people to understand what the wider context was of these things being created and bits of cities being created at that time. So I kind of went, yeah, okay, you know, I get that. That is interesting. And a very skilled interviewers who, because we had such time, you know, would ask quite different kinds of questions. And I remember being really kind of taken aback when she said to me, just describe to me, I can't remember, it was one of the periods of working life, and she suddenly said, tell me about the sounds of that period of your life, your working life, but your life generally. And I was, what do you mean? She said, well, what did you hear? And it makes you think about your life, your working life, your professional, in a very, very different way. Music is the obvious thing. But of course, I went actually back to the sounds of construction sites and the sounds of, you know, those meetings back in the 1990s where things could get a bit tasty at times. There was could be a lot of shouting at times. And just so it wasn't about what my answer was, but it was really interesting to be asked to look, and there was more than that. That was just one example of just thinking about a life and a career through different perspectives. And when you're asked a question like that, you don't necessarily give the answer that you'd normally give, because we kind of all have a narrative of our lives which we develop over years, and you know, you kind of get used to saying it to yourself and sometimes saying it out loud to other people. And sometimes you need to be knocked off that little pedestal that you've created, where you can kind of, it's not a pedestal, it's more of a soapbox, where you can kind of like tell your story, as it were, to reanalyze it and think about it in a slightly different way. And so, as I say, therapy is the wrong word, but it was, because it was a very, very enjoyable experience doing it, but it did really make me think about the work that I've done, why I've done it, in a very different way. And one of the things you realise, Pete, you often get asked the question, so what makes you get out of bed in the morning, and the rest of it. And you realise that the answer to that question is very different at different stages in your life. There isn't an answer that just stays the same all the way through. You know, it's back to that thing, you know, as a teenager and you're searching for identity, and then you're at work and you're trying to, you know, climb, you're trying to achieve, you're trying to, you know, for me, I just wanted to do more and more and more. So what got me out of bed every day during most of my working life was just to get stuff done. I just loved achieving stuff. The reason I got into this whole game in the first place was because I worked on a building site and I loved the building. You know, I was cutting bricks and mortar and all that stuff when I was an 18-year-old, and it's probably to this day, it's the happiest 6 months of my life was actually working as a brickies mate. It was just the most fun, and for me, real pleasure of like every single evening leaving and the building was bigger than when I arrived in the morning. So that making stuff, if there is one kind of driver to that's consistent in what gets you out of bed, it's to get to make stuff happen and build stuff. And so there was more at the end of the day than there was when you started. And the bad days were always when you felt like that went the other way. We've gone backwards. That always made me feel, I feel very forward looking. And so if I felt I'd gone backwards, that felt very negative for me. So there's that sort of like, you have a consistent theme, but the actual, you know, what makes you get out of bed does change over time. And, you know, it's different for me now than when I was in work, and it was different from the early stages of my work than the latter stages, and definitely different when, you know, you're at college and university.
Yeah, fascinating, Nick. And then maybe just to close, to leave everyone with it. If you were to sum up the now of that for you, what is that, do you think?
Yeah, I did a coaching course about 3-4 years ago, and I didn't do it to become a coach, and so I qualified as a coach. And it wasn't because I wanted to become a coach particularly, but I was fascinated by coaching and how coaching works, and because I found so much more of my work was now actually sitting down with people, and particularly not always younger people, a lot of younger people, but some people, my own age, and supporting them through challenges they were facing, and they're just trying to unlock something or get something done or get someone on board or something. And I was really fascinated by that process. And I find an awful lot of my work now is, as an advisor to a business, I actually spend a huge amount of my time actually just sitting with other people, and they're kind of like, I'm not sure what to do. It's like, what do we do? And I'm kind of working with them, and it's a cross between trying to help them to unlock their own thinking and bringing to bear my own experience, without just walking in and going, well, you don't want to do it like this, you want to do it like that. It's like, because that doesn't really help them in the long term. So there is a place for me to share my experience and to say, I've done this before, I can tell you about it and I can share that, and we can look at how that might play out in this situation. But it's finding that balance between sharing that experience and mentoring and coaching this quite broad group of people now. And that's what I'm fascinated by. It's very much, it's the people side of this. The reality for me is that the projects that I'm now, working on to seed and things, I'm not going to be around in Urban Partners in 20 years' time when they're going to be built. So I'm not going to see this in the way that I saw the projects through that I saw in my previous career. So there is definitely a mentality for me which is like, get as much out there and get these people understanding the issues, inform as much as you possibly can without trying to sound too grandiose about it. You just have an experience. Share the experience, and try and set this process up for success as much as you can through your lens. My lens is not the only lens. There's other ones sort of equally valid that look at it from a different perspective. But just bring that development experience lens to bear on this and try and set it up so it's got a chance to succeed. And that's great, because you're dealing with people more than I'm not seeing much being built right now, and it'll be 4 or 5 years before anything really seriously does get built. There's one in Copenhagen that will happen earlier than that. But so this is very much about helping to set it up.
Nick, thank you very much for your time today, and thanks very much for sharing all your experiences. It's been fascinating to sit and listen to.
Thank you, Tom. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.